Get ready for a deep dive, everyone, because today we're diving into ancient India.
Oh, yeah.
We are talking about the Battle of 10 Kings.
All right.
And this is a story you can find straight out of the Ṛgveda,
Mm-hmm.
one of the oldest texts in the world.
Absolutely.
It's like a historical mystery, but
Yeah.
wrapped in poetry, and we are so here for it.
I love it.
So let's get right into it.
Yeah.
But first,
Okay.
who are these 10 kings,
Yeah.
and what were they fighting over?
Okay.
It's giving Game of Thrones vibes.
You're not too far off with that comparison, actually.
Okay.
So imagine a huge power struggle, but for control over northern India.
Okay.
Around 2500 BC,
2500 BC.
during this period that we call the Mature Harappan civilization.
So we are talking like bustling cities,
Bustling cities.
advanced trade, like a whole civilization. Most history books kind of
Yeah, they really gloss over.
gloss over.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 10 kings then, were they like leaders of different...
So we're talking about leaders of different tribes,
Uh-huh.
different clans, all kind of vying for power.
2500 BC, you said.
2500 BC.
That date sounds familiar for a language nerd like me.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't it have something to do with like how languages evolved?
Yeah, you're totally right. That date is really important. That's actually when the Battle of 10 Kings gets really interesting. Because
Okay.
it might actually be like a snapshot
Okay.
of this massive migration event that led to the spread of Indo-European languages.
Hold on. Are you saying that
Yeah,
English,
yeah,
Spanish,
yeah.
Hindi,
Mm-hmm.
all of these languages, they didn't come from somewhere in like Europe or Asia?
So that's what's really interesting.
Okay.
A lot of people think that, but what we're looking at is potentially that these languages can be traced back to ancient India
Wow.
around the time of this battle.
So a totally different origin story
Totally different origin story,
than
though.
what we're used to.
Yeah, and it's called the out of India theory.
The out of India theory.
And it really challenges a lot of the traditional views on how these languages spread.
Okay, but how can we be sure that any of this really happened?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is this a true historical battle?
Yeah.
Or is it just a really captivating legend?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
So some scholars look at the Ṛgveda as a very reliable historical source,
Okay.
whereas others might interpret it more symbolically.
Okay.
Then on top of that, we have archaeological evidence. We have ancient genealogies.
Wow.
So it really is like piecing together this giant puzzle, but we don't have all the pieces, and we definitely don't have the picture on the box.
So we've got this epic battle, maybe,
Yeah.
that is potentially tied to the origins of so many languages,
Mm-hmm.
all happening in a civilization that flourished thousands of years ago.
Thousands of years ago.
How much of this is fact versus poetic storytelling?
That's what we're here to figure out.
Okay.
And one way to kind of approach this is by looking at how scholars interpret the Ṛgveda itself.
Okay.
Because it's written in such an old form of Sanskrit and it's full of symbolism and poetry,
Right.
it really is open to interpretation.
So how do we even begin to decode a text like that?
Yeah.
What can these different interpretations tell us about this battle?
So one thing that's really interesting is this rivalry between two big names,
Okay.
Vasiha and Vishwamitra.
Okay.
And these were like the rock stars of their time.
What?
Poets, priests, advisors to kings. I mean, these guys,
Wow.
they did it all.
Okay.
So to understand them
Yeah.
is to really understand this battle.
A rivalry between ancient poets and priests. That sounds like a story in and of itself.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of drama are we talking about here?
So their rivalry, it kind of pops up throughout the entire Ṛgveda.
Okay.
And some scholars believe that the Battle of 10 Kings may actually reflect their own power struggle.
Wow.
But it played out on a much larger scale with kings as their pawns.
Now, those are some high stakes.
Talk about high stakes,
Yeah.
right?
But if we're trying to find hard evidence for this,
Yeah.
we need to look at archaeology, right?
Archaeology.
What can all those dusty old artifacts tell us about this battle and the mature Harappan civilization?
So this is where it actually gets even more complex.
Okay.
Because for a really long time, the timeline of the mature Harappan civilization and the arrival of what we call the Indo-Aryan people,
Okay.
and this is the group that's associated with the Ṛgveda.
Yep.
That timeline didn't quite match up.
A timeline mismatch?
Yeah, a timeline mismatch.
What do you mean?
So scholars originally thought that the Indo-Aryan people arrived in India long after the mature Harappan civilization had already declined. But some recent archaeological digs are actually challenging that idea.
Okay, so this is like a plot twist in a history book.
A total plot twist.
What kind of findings are we talking about here?
So they're finding things like iron tools and evidence of ironworking, but from the mature Harappan period.
Okay.
Which is much earlier than what we previously thought.
So this is a really big deal because
it's huge.
It means that the people of the Ṛgveda didn't use iron widely.
Right.
And they were thought to have come to India much later.
Right.
But this changes that.
It completely changes
So
this.
are we talking about rewriting the history of ancient India?
It's a big possibility.
Wow.
And it could actually put the Battle of 10 Kings right in the heart of the mature Harappan civilization.
This is completely changing the picture.
It really is.
We're talking about potentially rewriting the history of a civilization.
Yeah.
And its connection to one of the oldest texts in the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is massive.
Absolutely massive. And there's another layer to this, too.
Okay.
Ancient Indian genealogies.
Genealogies.
Yeah.
You're talking about those long lists of like...
Exactly, those long lists.
Who beget whom.
Exactly.
Okay, what can those tell us?
So our source material mentions this historian.
Okay.
His name was F.E. Parjitter.
Okay.
And he actually reconstructed these ancient Indian genealogies.
Wow.
And in doing that, he found what are called synchronisms.
Synchronisms. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
So basically, he found links and potential overlaps in the timelines of different dynasties that were mentioned in these genealogies. So imagine them like cross-references, helping us to line up different rulers and events to create a much clearer picture of the historical timeline.
So it's like using family trees to piece together a bigger historical narrative.
Exactly, like using family trees.
So when Parjitter did this,
Yeah.
with the lineages that were involved in the Battle of 10 Kings, where did it place this event?
Right around 2500 BC.
Get out!
Right?
The language connections?
Crazy.
The revised archaeological timeline?
Yeah.
And now these genealogies all pointing to the same period.
It's wild.
It's almost too good to be true.
It's definitely compelling.
Yeah.
And it suggests that all these different pieces of evidence might actually be pointing to a common truth about this pivotal moment in history.
Okay, so we've got this convergence on 2500 BC.
Right.
But what about the location?
Yeah.
The source material mentions the Sarasvati River. Where does that fit in?
So the Sarasvati River is really interesting because it's kind of shrouded in both myth and history. Today, it's mostly dried up.
Really?
But back then, it was this massive river.
Wow.
Even considered more sacred than the Ganges.
Wow. So a pretty big deal then.
A huge deal.
During this like Ṛgvedic period. But how does it connect to this battle though?
So the Ṛgveda actually places the battle on the banks of the Purusni River.
Okay.
Which most scholars think is the modern-day Ravi River.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The Ṛgveda describes the Purusni flowing into the Sarasvati.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
We know that the Sarasvati was drying up by 1900 BC.
Right.
So if the Purusni was flowing into it when this battle happened...
It would have had to have happened before that.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Putting it right around that 2500 BC mark.
Which totally lines up with everything else we've been talking about.
It all connects.
It's wild, right?
Yeah, it's like all these little clues coming together to paint a clearer picture.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Ṛgveda for a second, though.
Okay.
You mentioned before that it's really open to interpretation.
Yeah, it's full of symbolism and poetry.
Right.
So you kind of have to be careful about taking everything literally.
So how do we even begin to understand a text like that?
Right.
What can it tell us about the battle itself?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to understand this on its own terms.
Right.
The language, the poetry, the cultural context.
Well, that's easier said than done.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We are talking about an incredibly old text here.
Incredibly old.
Written in a language that most people don't even understand today.
Right. But thankfully, we have scholars and translators who've really dedicated themselves to understanding the Ṛgveda.
Yeah.
And they've uncovered a ton of information.
So what are some of the things that they found? Like
Yeah.
what kind of insights can we glean from these interpretations?
One thing that's super interesting is how the Ṛgveda portrays the different sides.
Okay.
It doesn't really offer this simplistic good versus evil kind of narrative.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it suggests a much more nuanced picture
Okay.
with all these different motivations and alliances at play.
So it's not your typical heroes and villains story.
Not at all.
Okay.
I mean, even the 10 kings weren't necessarily a united front. They represented different tribes, different clans.
Right.
Some of them were probably even rivals with each other.
Wow.
And the Ṛgveda kind of hints at this web of political maneuvering and shifting loyalties.
Now that is drama.
Yeah, talk about a real-life Game of Thrones.
Right.
Ancient rulers making and breaking alliances, all for power.
So who won in the end?
Yeah.
Like, who are the victors of this battle?
So the Ṛgveda celebrates the victory of King Sudās,
Okay.
who was a Bharata king.
Bharata.
And that name Bharata is really important.
Okay.
Because our source material suggests that this victory was super crucial in establishing the Bharatas as this dominant force in northern India.
So this wasn't just a battle over territory.
No.
This was a battle for supremacy.
Absolutely.
And the outcome really shaped the political landscape.
And not just the political landscape. I mean, think about it.
Okay.
Bharata is still used today as another name for India.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah. So it really highlights the lasting impact of this battle. Right.
And how it's connected to the formation of this cultural and linguistic identity.
That continues to this day.
That continues to this day.
It's wild to think about how this one event,
right,
a story passed down for thousands of years,
mm-hmm,
could have such a massive impact.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
It really makes you wonder, what else could be hidden in the Ṛgveda?
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying these ancient texts so fascinating.
Yeah.
They aren't just relics of the past.
Right.
They're these dynamic sources of knowledge.
Right.
That reveal new things as we dig deeper.
You mentioned earlier that the Ṛgveda might contain clues about the origins of Indo-European languages.
Yeah.
Our source material mentions something called linguistic paleontology.
Mm-hmm.
What is that exactly?
So imagine being like a linguistic detective.
Oh, looking for clues, but within the words themselves.
Oh.
That's linguistic paleontology.
Gotcha.
So by studying the features of these ancient languages, scholars can kind of reconstruct different aspects of the cultures, the environments, even the migration patterns of the people who spoke them.
So you're saying it's like using language as a time machine?
Yeah, basically.
It's so cool.
It's really cool. And when we apply that to the Ṛgveda, that's when things get really interesting.
Okay.
For example, some scholars say that the absence of certain words, specifically ones that are related to Indian plants and animals, in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language, suggests that the Indo-European homeland was somewhere outside of India.
That makes sense. I mean, if they didn't have words for those things, they probably hadn't encountered them yet.
Exactly.
But I thought we were talking about the idea that the homeland might have been in India.
We are, and that's where the debate lies.
Okay.
Our source material presents kind of a counter-argument, saying that the absence of these words could actually point to a migration out of India.
Really? How so?
So think about it.
Okay.
If people are migrating away from a certain region, they may not take all of their vocabulary with them. Right. Especially words for things that they aren't encountering anymore.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, so instead of proving that the Indo-European homeland was outside of India, it could actually support the idea that it was in India all along.
Wow.
Yeah, and it just shows how important it is to really consider all sides when we try to reconstruct the past.
Yeah. This whole deep dive has really been an exercise in challenging assumptions.
It really has.
And embracing the complexities of history.
For sure.
We've uncovered linguistic connections, archaeological evidence, genealogies. Yeah. It all points to this massive significance of this one single event.
The Battle of 10 Kings.
It's amazing.
And to think it all came from one single text.
I know.
That's thousands of years old.
It really speaks to the power of these ancient stories.
And how important it is that we engage with them.
It reminds me that history is more than just names and dates.
It's a living tapestry.
Yeah.
Woven from these stories, battles, migrations, and the power of language.
And sometimes just a single event can echo through time.
And shape everything.
This has been an amazing deep dive.
It has been really fun.
Thank you so much for joining us and taking a deep dive into the Battle of 10 Kings.
This was one for the history books.
Or should we say the Ṛgveda?
The Ṛgveda.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Get ready, because today we're diving deep into the Dāśarajña, an ancient conflict that just might flip the script on how we see Indo-European languages. So put aside that Battle of 10 Kings idea. We're talking shifting alliances, whole campaigns, maybe even a whole new origin story for some of the world's biggest languages.
What's wild is we're not on about just one battle.
Right.
It's events over time across ancient India.
Yeah.
And get this, these events, they might unlock how languages like English, Spanish, Hindi, all link back to a common ancestor right here in India.
So we're talking King Sudās leading these campaigns, what, 2500 BC?
Around then, yep.
That's key, right? Because that lines up with the mature Harappan civilization at its peak.
Exactly.
Imagine a civilization so advanced.
Advanced.
They had urban planning, like rivaling modern cities. That's the mature Harappan civilization.
Impressive, isn't it?
And we're not talking small-time stuff here.
Oh, no.
Sudās was crossing major rivers, the Parun, Yamuna, Vipash, Shutudra.
Like a map, almost.
Right.
Rivers are like a map, showing us how these ancient folks moved.
Okay.
How different groups bumped into each other, how languages might have mixed.
So let's meet these groups.
Yeah.
In this historical drama.
Hit me.
King Sudās. Powerful Bharata king.
Powerful.
And a bunch of tribes he dealt with. The Turvasas, Matsyas, Drusas, Anavas, bunch more.
It's giving Game of Thrones, but with chariots, not dragons.
Right. Political intrigue.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And here's the thing. The research really pushes this idea that it wasn't heroes and villains, you know.
Yeah.
Some groups, like the Bugas, the Druyus, they were on Sudās' side one minute, against him the next.
Wow.
It's tangled, trying to untangle the Dāśarajña like a real historical puzzle.
And like any good puzzle, we need clues.
We do.
And some clues, they're in the names of these tribes. That's where it gets juicy.
Juicy indeed.
Names like Pakthas, Balanas, Alinas, Vietins, even Sivas.
Yeah, and all...
These names, they sound a lot like names that pop up way later in other parts of the world. Yeah. We're talking Pakhtuns, Baluchis, even ancient Greeks, the Hellenes.
Yeah, that's connection.
Like finding linguistic breadcrumbs.
Breadcrumbs, I like that.
Scattered through time and across the world.
Across the world. And what did those breadcrumbs lead to?
That's the question. They make us question the whole Aryan invasion theory, you know, that idea that Indo-European languages, they came to India with one massive migration.
Right, the standard story.
It's like historical common knowledge, right?
Almost like it's in the textbook, yeah.
But what if this research says otherwise?
Uh-oh. You got me hooked now.
So we've got these connections, right, pointing to maybe an Indian origin for these Indo-European languages.
It's bold, for sure.
But how does the research, like, how does it back that up?
It's like building a case, right? In this case, it hinges on language.
Okay.
We got those names, similar sounding, but it goes deeper. Looking at patterns in the languages, words they share, even how the grammar works across all these different Indo-European languages.
So it's like we're looking for family traits, not just in the names, but in the DNA of the languages themselves.
Think of it like a massive jigsaw puzzle, linguistic puzzle.
Okay.
And as you fit the pieces, you start to see it, this picture. And it's suggesting that the oldest form, the OG Indo-European language, might have been spoken right here in ancient India.
That's a pretty strong argument. But what about, like, physical proof? Archaeology, does that back this whole Indian origin thing up?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Archaeologists are wrestling with it right now.
I bet.
The evidence, it's not always crystal clear,
right?
But there are some hints. Like, take the mature Harappan civilization, thriving around the time of King Sudās.
Right.
They were incredibly advanced for their time. We're talking urban planning, they had standard weights and measures, even a writing system.
Wow.
All signs pointing to a really developed culture.
So, like, if the Harappans were already that advanced, it makes you think maybe they were the ones spreading their culture.
Spreading the knowledge.
Their language, not the other way around.
It's a good point. It's not direct proof, but it's something.
Yeah.
And when you put that together with the language clues, this Indian origin idea, it gains traction.
Like a historical plot twist makes you rethink everything.
Right.
Because if this is right, then what? We have to rewrite what we thought we knew about ancient migration, cultural exchange, all of it.
Yeah. You're hitting the nail on the head. That's why this research is so huge. If Indo-European languages started in India, it's a total game changer. How we see cultures moving, technology spreading, ideas traveling, the whole ancient world.
That's a massive shift.
Let's go back to King Sudās for a sec.
Our main man.
What's his role in all this?
He's not just a king in this story, he's a catalyst.
Oh.
His campaigns, the battles from the Dāśarajña, they might have accidentally set off the whole outward migration of people speaking these Indo-European languages.
So he's like accidentally set off this chain reaction
A linguistic domino effect.
that shaped how people speak across, what, Eurasia?
It's a wild thought, right?
Picture it. Sudās is expanding his kingdom, beating his rivals.
Okay.
Maybe he pushes some groups out, send them scattering, and those groups, they take their language with them,
Makes sense.
planting the seeds for the languages we see today.
Talk about unintended consequences.
You're kidding.
But we can't ignore the flip side here. You said not everyone's sold on this out of India idea.
Right. There are definitely critics.
What are they saying? What are the arguments against it?
One of the big ones is that, sure, the language stuff is suggestive, it's interesting, but it's still open to interpretation.
Yep.
Language changes constantly,
Yep.
right? It picks up bits from other languages, adapts to new places. Critics say those similarities we see, maybe they're just from languages bumping into each other, borrowing, maybe even coincidence.
So it's like we're trying to track a traveler's path,
Yeah.
but they've picked up souvenirs from everywhere.
Exactly.
Makes it hard to know what they started with.
Right. Hard to separate what's original, what's borrowed.
It's messy.
Very messy. And it gets more complicated. Critics also say, look, where's the hard proof? The archaeological evidence. If these languages spread from India outward, we should have more than just hints.
Right, like artifacts, settlements.
Exactly. Something concrete.
So it's kind of a stalemate then.
For now, you could say that.
The language crews are there, but the archaeological evidence is MIA.
That sums it up pretty well. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating to study.
Yeah, totally.
We still have so much to learn. Every new discovery could change everything.
And speaking of discoveries, we're about to dig into one of the biggest challenges to this whole out-of-India theory.
Oh, boy.
We'll hear out the critics, weigh the evidence, and leave you with some things to ponder about this whole debate.
All right, we're back.
Back at it. And things are about to get really interesting because we're diving into one of the biggest wrenches
Ooh, a wrench.
in the whole Indo-European languages started in India idea.
The plot thickens.
We've seen some cool language stuff, but like any good mystery,
Every mystery needs...
there are always other suspects.
Right. Gotta line them up.
And here, one of the main suspects,
Keep me with it.
it's called the Anatolian hypothesis.
Okay, Anatolian hypothesis. Lay it on me.
What's the deal there?
So instead of India,
Yeah.
the Anatolian hypothesis says, hold on, maybe those Indo-European languages, they actually got going in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey.
A whole different starting point
Whole different map.
for our language journey. So what's the evidence for this one?
People who like this theory, they point to these strong similarities between ancient Anatolian languages, like Hittite,
Okay.
and other parts of that Indo-European family tree.
Mm.
They say these similarities, the words, the grammar, they're too big to ignore.
Okay.
Like, hello, these languages had a common ancestor somewhere around Anatolia.
So it's like looking way back in your family tree
Right back.
and seeing that, whoa, a bunch of your relatives lived in the same area.
Exactly. You crack the code. And to be fair, there's a lot of research backing this theory up.
Right.
But, and this is where it gets even cooler,
Okay.
it's the Anatolian hypothesis.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily cancel out the whole India idea entirely.
Wait, hold up.
Buckle up.
How can there be two origin stories?
Okay.
Did languages have teleportation powers back then or something?
Not quite.
Yeah.
Language evolution, it's not always a straight line.
Right.
We're talking about things happening over thousands of years.
Right.
Lots of moving parts. Totally possible that there were many waves of migration.
Makes sense.
Groups bumping into each other, mixing their languages up. It's messy.
So it's not about finding that one true starting line.
Right.
It's about understanding this whole web of connections and changes over time.
You got it. It's like a braid, a river braid.
Oh, I like that.
Each strand is a different language, a different group.
Okay.
And these strands, they weave together, touch each other, make it tough to unravel back to the very beginning.
That's a great visual. Really
Yeah.
helps.
Glad it helps.
But if it's all tangled up like that, what happens to our understanding of the Dāśarajña then? And those names, the tribes, all that.
The million-dollar question. And this is where the research we've been digging into, it throws out this really neat idea.
What's that?
What if the Dāśarajña, instead of just being a little local thing,
Yeah.
it actually kicked off one of those strands in the braid breaking off,
Oh, wow.
sending those early Indo-European languages flowing outward?
So King Sudās, with his chariots and battles and everything,
Maybe. Just maybe.
he accidentally set off this whole linguistic chain reaction.
Yeah.
And that shaped languages we speak now.
It's a pretty wild thought to chew on, isn't it? But look, whether these Indo-European languages came from India, Anatolia, or somewhere in between.
Right.
The big takeaway here from this whole deep dive
Yeah, what is it?
is just how incredibly complex human history really is. We're trying to put together a puzzle, right? But it happened thousands of years ago. We've got pieces missing, no picture on the box to help us.
A real head-scratcher.
Totally. But even without all the pieces, it's still amazing to see this bigger picture taking shape.
It absolutely is.
And who knows what we'll find next? Every inscription, every artifact
It could change everything.
could rewrite the whole story.
That's what makes this whole thing so captivating, right? There's always more to learn, more to debate, more to discover.
Always more to find.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this.
Okay.
Next time you hear someone speaking another language, one that sounds totally different from your own.
Yeah.
Remember King Sudās?
King Sudās.
Remember the Dāśarajña and that incredible journey that languages have been on, shaping our world even today. All right, get ready, because this deep dive takes us to ancient India, a time and place that's, well, a bit of a mystery, wouldn't you say? We're diving into your research about a king, a conqueror, really, who might completely change how we see the Harappan civilization.
It's like we're about to rewrite history. That's what's so fascinating about this theory. It turns what we thought we knew about the rise of the Harappan civilization on its head.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention. Who is this mystery ruler, and why haven't we heard of him before?
His name is Sudās Paijavana. And you're right, you won't find him in many history books. But the research suggests he was a major force, maybe even a king, around 2500 BC. That puts him right at the peak of the mature Harappan civilization.
2500 BC, that's going back almost 5,000 years. Hard to even imagine. How do we even know about Sudās if he's not in the history books?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We have to go to the Ṛgveda, an ancient collection of hymns. It actually gives us a glimpse into the politics and society of that time.
Oh, I've heard of the Ṛgveda. It's a sacred text, right? But it's more than just religious stuff, I'm guessing.
Exactly. It's an incredible source of information about ancient India. Inside the Ṛgveda, we find these hymns called the Dāśarajña, and traditionally, they've been interpreted as a story about one epic battle.
A battle with 10 kings. Wow, that sounds intense.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the twist in the research. These hymns, they might not be about just one battle. They could be describing decades of Sudās' campaigns, his rise to power, and how he built potentially a massive empire.
Wait, so instead of one big battle, it's more like a whole era of conquest. That changes things.
Yes. And to really grasp how big of a deal this is, we need to think about the timelines. The research links Sudīs' rule to the height of the mature Harappan period, and it uses two main lines of thinking, frameworks, I guess you could call them.
Frameworks. All right, I'm following.
Okay, so the first one connects the rise of the Harappan civilization, with all its incredible cities, to the spread of Indo-European languages.
Yeah.
Specifically, something called the Eastern dispersal. It's
like a wave of language and culture moving eastward. I can see how a powerful ruler like Sudās expanding his territory would fit into that.
Exactly. Now, the second framework, it looks at those ancient Indian genealogies. Basically a giant family tree of rulers.
Oh, wow.
And get this. Both frameworks, the language spread and the genealogies, they suggest that Sudās would have been alive and ruling right at the start of this major cultural shift around 2500 BC.
So we've got two separate pieces of evidence pointing to the same thing, Sudās as a major player during the rise of the mature Harappan civilization. It's like you said, this could change everything.
And it gets even more exciting when we start looking at the locations of these battles. Picture a map of ancient India crisscrossed with these rivers, essential to life back then. The Ṛgveda talks about Sudās' battles along the Sarasvati River, going up against tribes like the Yadus and the Paktas. They weren't small battles either. They reshaped the entire political landscape.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that the geography where these battles happen lines up almost perfectly with the heartland of the mature Harappan civilization.
So it's like we're mapping out the edges of this potential empire by following the rivers. Rivers were everything back then, weren't they? Not just for water, but also trade routes, transportation.
Exactly, the lifeblood of ancient India. If you controlled the rivers, you controlled everything. I mean, can you imagine what those rivers must have seen? Armies on the move, boats full of goods, maybe even messengers from different kingdoms trying to make deals.
I know, right? It really comes to life. Speaking of fascinating details, the research you sent mentioned these tribes, the Anava tribes and their Puras.
Ooh, the Anavas. They're a real mystery. The Ṛgveda just gives us these little glimpses into who they were. We know they had these kuras, which could have been anything from huge Harappan cities to fortresses up in the mountains. What if archaeologists find one someday? A lost Navapura. Talk about a find.
It's like a puzzle within a puzzle. We've got clues about these cities. Were they like the other Harappan cities or completely different? And get this, Sudās didn't always just wipe out his enemies. It wasn't always about total destruction.
You're right. There's this one part in the Ṛgveda that's always stuck with me. It says that sometimes Sudās' forces, they'd conquer the Inava settlements but wouldn't destroy everything. They'd leave the resources untouched. That's pretty interesting, don't you think?
It's like he knew how to play the long game, right? Instead of just crushing everyone, he absorbed them, took their resources, brought them into the fold. Smart move for building an empire.
Absolutely. It makes you think he understood that real power wasn't just about winning battles, but about strategy, alliances, and gathering resources. And this was during a time when all sorts of different cultures were interacting, sometimes clashing, as the mature Harappan civilization grew. Maybe Sudās' reign was a turning point.
It's all starting to come together. This powerful king, brilliant strategist, leading his armies across the plains and rivers, building alliances, consolidating his power. It's like watching a civilization being born.
Exactly. And that brings us to the heart of this whole idea that Sudās Paijavana, through all these battles, alliances, and conquests, might have been the driving force behind the unification and flourishing of the mature Harappan civilization.
This is mind-blowing. We're talking about completely changing how we see a major period in ancient Indian history. But it also makes you wonder, if Sudās Paijavana was so important, so crucial to the mature Harappan civilization, why haven't we heard more about him? Why isn't he a household name?
It's the big question, isn't it? Like finding a hidden room in a palace. You have to ask, why was it sealed off? Who might have wanted to erase Sudās from history?
You're making me feel like an archaeologist myself, digging for clues. You think there was some historical foul play going on?
Let's just say, history tends to be written by the winners. Remember the Kurus, the dynasty that came after. The research suggests they had their reasons for downplaying how amazing Sudās really was.
Because the Kurus were descended from one of the kings Sudās defeated, right?
Exactly. And not just little defeat. The Ṛgveda makes it clear that Sudās was totally victorious. So you can imagine why the Kurus might want to tweak the story a little.
To make themselves look good. Centuries later, when they're in charge, they want to make sure everyone thinks they're the rightful rulers. What better way than to downplay the king who crushed their ancestor?
Right. It's like that game of telephone. The story changes a bit each time it's told, and over time, those stories become the accepted truth. And so Sudās Paijavana, the great conqueror, the unifier, he gets forgotten. It really makes you think the history we learned isn't always the whole truth. It's colored by people's biases, their interpretations, maybe even a little political spin.
It makes you realize that history is never really finished, is it? We're always finding new evidence, asking new questions.
Absolutely. That's what's so cool about research like this. It pushes us to look beyond the usual stories, dig a little deeper, question everything.
It's like we found a secret library full of forgotten stories. If Sudās' story could be hidden for so long, what else is out there? What other mysteries are waiting to be solved in these ancient texts?
The possibilities are endless. And the best part is, you don't have to be a historian or an archaeologist to get excited about these discoveries. Every time we ask questions, every time we look at the past with curiosity, we're taking part in uncovering those hidden stories.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and names in a book. It's about real people, their stories, the marks they left on the world. And those marks, well, we're still discovering them today. Who knows what other mysteries are still out there just waiting to be found?